Greetings, Shabbat Shalom. This morning, when I spoke at the Flair Church, and I hope a lot of you were able to see that or could see it later, I was unaware of an event which was taking place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. A very horrific event. And the Ecclesiastes tells us there is a time to mourn. So there is a time to be sober, and this is one of those times. A very horrific event has occurred. Those of you who may see this at a much later date, the 18th of Cheshvan will now become a memorial for many people many members of a synagogue, the Tree of Life Synagogue, or others who were attending, who died on this day. And then others were hurt, and police were hurt, and so on. A very horrific event. And I want to comment that the real basis of anti-Semitism is actually hostility to God himself. Anti-Semitism is the most persistent and virulent prejudice in the world. If you study various forms of prejudice, the most persistent and virulent is anti-Semitism. And it goes back to a hostility against God himself, because it is God who ultimately is to whom we're accountable, who tells us what to do. If you read many of Hitler's comments, he comments against conscience, which he says was a Jewish invention. He attacks the Ten Commandments. He attacks Bolshevism, yes, but he also attacks Christianity, both of whom he says come from Judaism. So because people can't lash out at God, either because they're afraid to or because really, what can they do? They focus their hatred on the people who tend to be associated with God. Those who remain of the people of Israel, the chosen people, they become the object of attack. And it's not because they're particularly saintly or particularly wicked for that matter. It's just because people associate them with God. And that's the way they kind of lash out at God by lashing out at the Jews. That really is the basic bottom line of anti-Semitism. Now today I want to talk about a very different kind of person than one who attacks because of bias or prejudice. I want to talk about a man of great zeal for righteousness, a man who was intensely dedicated to what is good, what is helpful, who was intently dedicated to serving God. And that is, I want to do homage to a biblical hero. Homage to a biblical hero. And I begin by talking about Jesus Christ as the perfect man, the sinless man. And in John 2, you see that he had tremendous zeal, not to harm anyone, but zeal to purify a holy place, to cleanse a holy place, and to point out people's sins, not to insult or to make people feel bad, but to point out their sins so that they could repent of their sins. And so Jesus had perfect zeal for righteousness. I want to talk about a man in the Bible who, if you look in the book of Chronicles, he had the name of Chelubai. I suppose in American English we would say Chelubai. He had that name, and how did he come across the name? Why did his parents name him Chelubai? I would speculate that they wanted him to be a treasure chest, a container of good qualities or of talents or of blessings. That would be my speculation as to why they gave him that kind of name. I don't want to go into all the etymology of it. But he had a shorter version of his name, Kalev, or Caleb. From Cheluvai, he had the name Caleb, Kalev. And that is related to Kelev, a dog. And the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says that it would indicate the characteristic of raging like a mad dog. And he had that quality, but in a positive way. He was intent, and he had an anger, but an anger for evil, a love for people, a love for God, and an anger against what is evil. And he had a desire to be righteous and to serve God and to do what was right. Now, sometimes we give them the nickname Mad Dog to a criminal. But sometimes we give it to a man who has a zeal to protect and defend, such as the Secretary of Defense of the United States, James Mattis. He has this nickname, Mad Dog Mattis. And it's not indicating pejorative or fear of the man, but rather respect for him as a warrior for righteousness, for liberty, for freedom. The defender not only of this country, but this country is a defender of the freedom of many other nations. That many nations owe their very existence to this country. As I recall, Franklin D. Roosevelt described this country as the arsenal of democracy. So sometimes this nickname of Mad Dog is a positive thing, and that's how it turned out in Caleb's life. I want to begin by going to Numbers, the 13th chapter. And here we see in the 13th chapter, we see Hoshea, the son of Nun, whose name was changed to Yehoshua, and we see Caleb. Yehoshua was from the birthright nation of Joseph, particularly the dominant tribe of Ephraim, and Caleb was from the scepter tribe of Judah. Ephraim, by right of being blessed by divinely inspired Jacob, being blessed by divinely inspired Jacob, Ephraim became the dominant tribe of the people of Joseph, and thus the birthright tribe, or the leading birthright tribe, one could say. And Judah was the scepter tribe, the tribe who would give us the Davidic kings, David and the Davidic kings, and ultimately the Messiah, Jesus Christ. These two were two great witnesses in the wilderness, serving under two great witnesses, Aaron and Moses. And without going through all that typology, but evidently in this case, Caleb was the senior witness in age, but Joshua was the one who ultimately came to dominate. Just as in the case of Aaron and Moses, Aaron was senior in age, and Moses was the one who dominated. So I want to go to Numbers 13 and verse 25. And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. Now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron. And actually, I want to summarize what was said to save time. They said the place is great. Here's what we bring back. And to this very day, the Israeli tourism ministry has the symbolism of two spies with a pole and carrying a cluster of grapes to indicate, the fruit of the land. That's the symbol of the Israeli tourism ministry, which is a critical part of Israel's economy, and many of you have probably seen that logo. So they said, here's the produce, but on the other hand, the people there are mighty and powerful, and will never be able to overcome them. And so in verse 32, and they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. And so let's go further. So all the congregation of Israel lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. Now let's get a perspective here. These were the people who had witnessed the 10 plagues. They've been miraculously liberated from the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And then in the wilderness, as they approached the wilderness, they had seen God split the Red Sea for them. They walked across. They'd seen him drown the Egyptians. They were led by a cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. Their clothes were not wearing out. It's amazing. They had had the theophany at Mount Sinai. They were being fed miraculously by manna. But in spite of all of that, they finally, I guess, had come to the point where now they're saying, no, we can't do this. But look at it. God could do it. It's not a matter whether they could do it. God had promised that they would inherit that land. But this is human nature, and we have to be very careful as we read this account that this could be you and me if we don't maintain our relationship with God. So all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why has the Eternal brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? Again, this is human nature. A lot of times when we're going through rough times, we think back to earlier times which we think were better, but they really weren't. So they said to one another, let us elect a leader and return to Egypt. Could you imagine? Yes, you can. I think you can. But this is, in effect, the epitome of this kind of problem that we have as human beings. Like, what have you done for us lately? Sure, you've done all these things. You're still doing things. But we want more. We want assurance that we're going to conquer the land. Well, they did have assurance that they were going to conquer the land. They had his promise. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. This was a crisis time, a time for prayer. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. They were in mourning for their people. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Eternal delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Remember these promises. Kind of reminds me of that hymn that some of you know, Standing on the Promises of God. The two of them were, and Moses and Aaron. Only do not rebel against the Eternal, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Eternal is with us. Do not fear them. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. So they were risking their lives. If you don't like the message, kill the messenger. And unfortunately, that also remains a part of daily life. But God, in this case, intervened. This was a crisis in the history of the church of major, monumental proportions. And God intervened miraculously. Now the glory of the Eternal appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. Then the Eternal said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? So he said, let's start anew. Let's wipe out the bulk of them and start anew. And so Moses could have said, I don't blame you. I'll step aside and let you do it. No. He passed this test as a leader. He loved his people. Loyalty is not only from the bottom up. Loyalty is also from the top down. And Moses loved his people, and he prayed to God to spare them. And God did. But he did decide that this older generation that rebelled needed to be punished. Then verse 20. Then the Eternal said, I have pardoned according to your word. Moses was a type of Christ. And Moses prayed for the people, and God spared them. Just as Jesus Christ is our intercessor. And we are saved through forever, really. We're given eternal life through his intercession. Moses, through his intercession, saved this nation of Israelites. But truly, as I live, God says, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Eternal. I'm the God of the universe. I'm omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, perfect love, and eternal. And these people are going to have to learn to respect me better. Because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness and have put me to the test, now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. Caleb shall inherit the land. He stood up for me. He stood up for me against the vast majority. But a few with God, or even one with God for that matter, is a majority. But these few, Caleb, Joshua, Moses, Aaron, these few, and any others who were with them, they were the minority, but God was with them. And Caleb had the courage and the faith to stand for the truth. And so Caleb was spared, and his family continued on to produce progeny for life in the promised land. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valley. Tomorrow turn and move out into the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. And the Eternal spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation who complain against me? I have heard the complaints which the children of Israel make against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Eternal, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. You said, we're going to die. All right, you're going to die. The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in the wilderness. All of you who are numbered, according to your entire number, from 20 years old and above. So God in his mercy allowed the children of these people to inherit the land. So at least these people could have that satisfaction, that their children would inherit the land. Except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun, you shall be by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. But notice, these two witnesses, Caleb of Judah, Joshua of Ephraim, they would be there. And Joshua ultimately became the leader who would lead them as the overall leader, and Caleb played a role in the conquest of the land, as we'll see. But your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I'll bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. You said I couldn't do it, but I can and I will. And let's go to, I'll just continue reading these last 3 verses here. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and bear the brunt of your infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. You will live as a wilderness people, as a desert people, a Bedouin-type lifestyle. That's what you'll have. And your children will then enter the promised land and settle in. According to the number of the days which you spied out the land, 40 days. For each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year. 40 is the number of trial and testing. And there's a principle in prophecy, as you know, a day for a year, which you find here and elsewhere. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days. For each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. Psalm 95 speaks of this. Hebrews 3 and 4 speaks of this. Joshua then led them, their children, not them, but their children, into the promised land. Caleb was with him. And by this time, it's 40 years later. And yet Caleb still has that enthusiasm. He doesn't falter in his zeal for what is right, what is good, what is true. He doesn't falter in his enthusiasm, his love for God, his love for his people, his love for God's promises, his desire to see those promises fulfilled. Let's go to Joshua 14. Joshua, we're now in the book of Joshua 14 and verse 5. As the Eternal had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did, and they divided the land. Then the children of Judah came to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, perhaps Kenizzite is a indication that he was one who hunted. That there's various speculation as to why he has that term. Or it may be that the Kenizzites, there were a group of Kenizzites who evidently were descendants of Edom. Perhaps they ultimately were amalgamated into Judah. And so he was of Judahite, but way back in his ancestry was Edomite background. Anyway, we'll continue on. He says this. But Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, you know the word which the Eternal said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Eternal, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. I had a heart that was intent on serving God. I was 40 years old then. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Eternal my God. These 10 leaders had swayed the people in a negative direction. And so these 10, unfortunately, were able to convince the majority to go against the 2 positive spies and also against Moses and Aaron. Very sad, but that can happen. We have a saying, the fish stinks at the head. Begins to stink at the head. If you have a corrupt leadership, it can permeate the whole nation. On the other hand, there's another saying that a people get the government they deserve. In other words, a corrupt culture produces corrupt government, so it works both ways. Anyway, in verse 9, So Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have wholly followed the eternal my God. So not only did God make this promise, but Moses reaffirmed it. And now, behold, the Eternal has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years. So we've had 40 years, 5 more, and they're conquering the land. They've been in the land 5 years. He's 85 years old. But has he waned or faltered in his enthusiasm? No! At 85, here's what he says. And now, behold, the Eternal has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, ever since the Eternal spoke this word to Moses, while Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now I am this day 85 years old. And yet I'm as strong this day as on the day that Moses sent me. Just as my strength was then, so now is my strength for war, both for going out and for coming in. I can do the job, I can get the job done, as God wants us to do. Now therefore, give me this mountain of which the Eternal spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, these gigantic people, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Eternal will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out as the Eternal said. Faith. Faith can move mountains. In this case, faith can inherit mountains, or we would describe them in America as hills. And Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh as an inheritance. Hebron, the ancient city of Hebron, where Abraham dwelt. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite to this day, as the time of the writing of this book that I'm reading. Why? Because he wholly followed the eternal God of Israel. And the name of Hebron before was Kiryat Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land had rest from war. Now later on, Hebron was given the center of the city to the descendants of Aaron. It was one of the 13 priestly cities. But the area around, there were villages around the central city. They remained territory of Judah, of Caleb. And in the center, where you could say whatever the equivalent was of the metropolis of that small town, maybe it became larger later, but the center was for the priests, and then around it continued to be a part of the inheritance of Judah. So the promise was kept, even though the priests were given an inheritance there. Judah remained also there. Now you see that Caleb, even at 85, had that same enthusiasm he had when he was 40, that same confidence, that same faith in God, in the God who had kept him alive, sustained him, and miraculously sustained those people, and had promised and would keep his promises. And let's go now to the book of Judges. We see that he has a role to play as history goes on and the land is conquered. I want to go to Judges, the first chapter. And I want to go to Judges 1 and verse 11. I'm going to break into a thought here. Judges 1:11, okay, 1:1:1. Let's go to Judges 1:11. And talking about Judah, the tribe of Judah. From there they went against the inhabitants of Devir. The name of Devir was formerly Kiryat Sefer. Then Caleb said, here he is. Now that, Caleb had asked Joshua for an inheritance, now he encourages others. Go out there and do what God wants you to do. The land should be conquered because these people, they should have fled. They should have fled, but they didn't. They were a very debased people. You read about some of their practices, for example, in Leviticus 18 and elsewhere. And they should have fled, but they decided to oppose the Israelites. So Israel's going to go in and conquer the land. And Caleb encouraged people to follow his example and serve God in that way. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiryat Sefer and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. Now, if you heard what I read this morning, she would have been agreeing to this. He wouldn't do this against her will if you read other verses. At least I would assume not, based on other verses in the Bible. Numbers 36 and Genesis 24. So I would, in other words, the right thing to do would have been for her to obviously be willing to agree with this, according to the Bible. So what actually happened, I can't tell you, but that's what the Bible indicates. that the woman has to agree to a marriage. She has to marry, the man she wants to marry. That's what the Bible says. Anyway, verse 12. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Sefer and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So he gave him his daughter Achsah as wife. So his nephew took it, and in those days, cousins could marry. Biblically, cousins can marry. Now, evidently, incest was something that became more and more dangerous through history. I don't know the genetics or biology involved, but incest evidently became more and more problematic through history. And, of course, incest is prohibited in Leviticus 18. But marriage of cousins was permitted biblically, but it is illegal in many countries because it is a health hazard. But evidently, back then, it was not the health hazard that it became. 14. Now it happened when she came to him, the daughter of Caleb, that she urged him to ask her father for a field. So, she urged her husband, ask your father-in-law, because we need more. He's a leader. He's got a lot that he has been able to conquer because God has blessed him. He's a man of faith, a man of courage, and he's a man of generosity, and he'll help us. But it seemed like the husband was reluctant, and so she takes the bull by the horns, metaphorically, and she is bold enough and righteous enough to do the right thing and ask her father. All right, and she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you wish?" So evidently, her husband, didn't stand up to the plate. To use a baseball analogy, he didn't stand up to the plate, so now she did. Verse 15. So she said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. So he was a generous father. So you see, not only was he zealous for righteousness, but you see that his righteousness extended to his family. He gave his wife to a man who had the courage to take that city. And yet, even though he had the courage to take that city, he seemed to shrink in making a request of his father-in-law, which is not a rare thing, I believe. But yet, she therefore stepped out and did it. And, of course, her father-in-law said, sure, I'll do it. And so he gave a great blessing to his daughter and son-in-law. So he was a man of zeal and, of course, a man of generosity. So you see that the example that Caleb set in the Bible is a very powerful one. Here's a person who had such faith and courage. He stood against the majority of people who lacked faith and courage. He had confidence in God's promises, and his confidence was repaid. He was sustained. And lived to see the conquest of the land, and lived to participate in it even at an advanced age, and lived to generously provide for his daughter and son-in-law in the promised land. So his enthusiasm did not diminish through his life, and he completed his life from what we see in the Bible as a man of great faith. And the Apostle Paul brings that out in what he says about himself, his autobiographical statement in 2 Timothy. I believe that Paul, following the example of Caleb, had this to say in 2 Timothy 4. And I want to go to verse 7. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7. At the end of his life, Paul too had maintained his enthusiasm. He'd maintained his dedication to what is right. So as we get older, some of you who are listening to me, I hope, are very young. Well, I know my grandson Gideon is young. But on the other hand, some of you who are listening to me are my age or more. And we must continue to keep that relationship with God going all the days of our lives and keep that enthusiasm going. Great things will yet happen for God's church. And God willing, those of you who are listening to me will yet live to see that. In any case, those of you who are listening to me, if you heed what I say, we will be able to see that world to come when Jesus Christ returns. We can be a part of that. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 7, Paul says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And so, Paul says, in verse 8. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown in righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. I hope that includes those of you who are listening to me now. And that is why today I gave homage to a biblical hero. Today my subject was Caleb, and I gave homage to a biblical hero. I ask you to pray for those who have been affected by this recent tragedy in Pittsburgh. And of course, let's continue to pray to our Father in heaven, your kingdom come. All the best to you and yours.